The year was 1941, a time when Britain's survival hinged on a fragile chain of ships stretching across the cold, unforgiving Atlantic. Each convoy that left Halifax or Liverpool carried not just supplies, but the very lifeblood of a nation under siege. Beneath those waves, unseen and silent, the enemy waited, packs of German U-boats hunting together in what would become known as the Wolfpack tactic. This was the beginning of the Battle of the Atlantic, a struggle not for territory, but for endurance, courage, and communication. The early months were marked by chaos. Convoys HX-79 and SC-7, sailing in October 1940, would become the first grim examples of what the Kriegsmarine's new strategy could do. SC-7 left Sydney, Nova Scotia, with 35 merchant ships, protected by only a handful of small corvettes. It was a mismatched force, mostly older vessels ill-equipped to detect submarines. As the convoy reached the mid-Atlantic, beyond the reach of air cover, Admiral Karl Dönitz's Wolfpacks moved in. U-99, commanded by Otto Kretschmer, the most successful U-boat ace of the war, was among them. Under the cloak of night and radio silence, the German submarines attacked. Between October 16th and 19th, SC-7 was torn apart. Torpedoes slammed into merchant hulls with devastating precision. Flames lit the dark sea as sailors scrambled for survival in freezing waters. HMS Bluebell, one of the escorts, reported, "So many burning ships. It was like daylight on the horizon. Of the 35 vessels, 20 were sunk." Only hours later, Convoy HX-79 met a similar fate. Another Wolfpack descended. The British escort commander, Captain Johnny Walker, who would later become a legend in anti-submarine warfare, could do little to prevent the slaughter. 10 ships went down in a single night. The ocean had turned into a graveyard. To the Royal Navy, it was more than a tactical defeat. It was a wake-up call. British Naval Command realized that old convoy methods were no match for coordinated submarine warfare. The Admiralty scrambled to adapt, but resources were thin and morale was shaken. In the cold halls of the Admiralty building, reports poured in describing ghost ships, convoys that simply stopped responding, their last known coordinates vanishing into the Atlantic abyss. In the personal log of Otto Kretschmer, later captured and translated, a chilling entry was found. "The sea hides all. We strike and disappear. They never know where we will come from next." His words reflected the deadly rhythm of a new kind of war, one fought not by fleets, but by shadows. In response, the Allies began experimenting with sonar, then called ASDIC, and long-range radar. Yet even these technologies could not fully penetrate the depths. Many ships were lost without a trace, their positions unknown even decades later. Among the missing was the SS Empire Brigade, last seen signaling distress off Rockall Bank. Its final message: attacked from beneath, ship breaking apart. For the men aboard these convoys, every voyage became a test of nerve. Submariners described the tension of silence, the strain of hours listening for the faint ping of sonar or the hum of propellers above. Survivors recalled that the sound of torpedoes closing in was like a train rushing through darkness. By late 1941, British and Canadian escorts began to form specialized support groups, faster, more coordinated, and better armed. But victory was still distant. The Atlantic was vast, and the U-boats always seemed one step ahead. As winter closed in, London braced for shortages. The loss of so many ships meant fuel rations, empty warehouses, and hungry cities. Prime Minister Winston Churchill would later confess that the only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. The convoys that burned in the mid-Atlantic became symbols of sacrifice and of mystery. Some wrecks, such as those of SC-7, were not rediscovered until nearly 70 years later, scattered across the seabed like silent witnesses to terror. And yet, in 1941, few could predict that the nightmare was only beginning. The Atlantic would soon become deadlier still. Not just a battlefield, but a graveyard of secrets. As 1942 dawned, the United States entered the war, bringing new ships, new codes, and new hopes. But with it came new mistakes, new tragedies, and the most disastrous convoy operation of all, the fate of PQ-17, where confusion and fear would doom dozens of ships in the icy Arctic seas. In the summer of 1942, the Arctic Ocean became a highway of peril. From Iceland and Scotland, Allied convoys set out through freezing waters toward the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, carrying tanks, aircraft, and ammunition vital to the Eastern Front. These voyages, part of a secret commitment to support the USSR, were among the most dangerous missions of the war, but none would become as infamous as Convoy PQ-17. On June 27, 1942, 35 merchant ships, escorted by 6 destroyers, 2 corvettes, and several anti-aircraft vessels, left the Icelandic port of Hvalfjörður. The men aboard knew their odds. German reconnaissance aircraft had already sighted the formation, and reports of a new threat, the battleship Tirpitz, lurking in Norwegian fjords, spread through the fleet like wildfire. Still, morale held. Many believed that Allied air power and naval coordination would protect them. It would not. Among the convoy was the American Liberty ship Daniel Morgan, loaded with Sherman tanks and aircraft parts. Its captain, William L. Barnes, recorded in his log, "Visibility poor, fog thick, crew tense, every man aware that if the U-boats or the Luftwaffe find us, we are finished." The first attacks came on July 2nd. German Heinkel bombers swooped from the clouds, dropping torpedoes that tore into the convoy's rear guard. 2 ships sank within minutes. Escort vessels fired anti-aircraft guns into the mist, filling the sky with flak and smoke. For 3 days, PQ-17 endured wave after wave of attacks from both air and sea. But the worst was yet to come, not from the enemy, but from within the Allied command itself. In London, Admiral Sir Dudley Pound received intelligence reports suggesting Tirpitz was moving to intercept PQ-17. The battleship's reputation as the most dangerous warship in Europe filled the Admiralty with dread. Fearing the annihilation of the entire convoy, Pound issued an order that would become one of the most controversial decisions of the war. Convoy is to scatter. At 9:23 p.m. on July 4th, the message was transmitted across the icy airwaves. Convoy is to scatter. In a moment, discipline collapsed. Without the protective screen of escorts, the merchant ships broke formation, each turning desperately toward the Arctic ice fields or open ocean. It was chaos. Some captains hesitated, others panicked. The sea became a graveyard of isolated targets. The Germans moved in for the kill. U-88, U-4557, and U-703 intercepted stragglers over the next several days. Ship after ship was torpedoed and lost. The Peter Kerr, the Christopher Newport, the Alcoa Ranger, all went down. Survivors clung to lifeboats in near-freezing water, surrounded by ice floes and oil slicks. Those who didn't freeze succumbed to exhaustion or despair. By July 10th, only 11 of the original 35 merchant ships reached Murmansk. 24 had been sunk. The British and American press would later call it the Convoy of Disaster. The Tirpitz, it turned out, had never even left port. The feared attack was a phantom, a mirage created by misinterpreted signals. Yet for years afterward, the true reason behind the Admiralty's decision remained shrouded in secrecy. Some historians believe there were intelligence leaks suggesting the Germans had broken Allied codes. Others suspect that the order to scatter was the result of disinformation deliberately spread by the Abwehr, the German intelligence service. In 1972, declassified communications hinted that ultra-decrypts, the Allies' most secret advantage, had played a role in the confusion, but no conclusive link was ever proven. For the men who survived PQ-17, the memory of those frozen waters never faded. Second Officer John Doyle of the Navarino later recalled, "It wasn't the enemy that doomed us. It was our own fear, the fear of what might be coming." His words captured the tragic essence of the battle. That misjudgment, not firepower, had destroyed the convoy. In the decades since, divers have found the wrecks of PQ-17 ships scattered across the Arctic seabed, silent testaments to human error and endurance. One ship, the Onomu, lies upright, its cargo of tanks still chained to the deck. Another, the Panama, rests split in two, its bow pointing toward the Soviet coast it never reached. PQ-17's destruction sent shockwaves through Allied naval command. Future convoys to Russia would carry heavier escorts, better communication, and stricter coordination. But the damage had been done. In the North Atlantic, German morale soared. Donitz praised his U-boat captains, calling PQ-17 the decisive proof that Allied arrogance can be broken. The Arctic convoy disaster left behind more than wrecks. It left questions. Was Tirpitz ever really meant to sail? Did British intelligence overreact? Or was someone feeding false information into the chain of command? The truth remains buried in classified archives and frozen waters. As 1943 dawned, the Allies sought redemption. They launched two massive convoys, HX-229 and SC-122, across the heart of the Atlantic. What happened next would become the largest and most brutal convoy battle of the entire war. March 1943. The Atlantic had become a chessboard of steel and silence. Every convoy that left Halifax or Liverpool carried the fate of the war upon its decks, and every shadow beneath the waves carried death. The Germans called it the Zweite Happy Time, the second happy time, when U-boats ruled the ocean. That month, two Allied convoys, HX-229 and SC-122, would sail into history as the most brutal engagement of the entire Battle of the Atlantic. Convoy HX-229 departed New York on March 8th, bound for Britain with 40 merchant ships loaded with fuel, grain, and war materials. SC-122 followed shortly after, slower but on a similar route. Unknown to the Allies, Admiral Karl Dönitz had just ordered his Wolfpacks, over 40 submarines, to converge in a wide arc across the North Atlantic. Through Enigma-coded radio transmissions, they formed a deadly net stretching hundreds of miles. The stage was set for a massacre. For the men aboard those ships, the voyage began like any other. Cold winds, rough seas, and the monotony of endless grey horizons. Then, on March 15th, the first contact reports came in. German U-boat commander Siegfried von Forstner of U-402 spotted the approaching convoys through his periscope. His brief message: "Convoy sighted. Position 53° N, 33° Borealis," triggered a chain reaction. Within hours, more than 30 U-boats began to close in. Night fell on March 16th like a curtain over a stage. The Wolfpack struck first at SC-122. Torpedoes streaked through the dark waters, exploding against the sides of the Nariva and Empire Impala. Flames rose into the night sky. HMS Dianthus and Godisha, British Flower-class corvettes, raced to rescue survivors, dropping depth charges as they went. The explosions churned the sea, sending shock waves through the freezing air. But the U-boat slipped away, silent and unseen. Meanwhile, HX-229, just miles away, came under coordinated attack from both sides. U-221, U-600, and U-615 each fired spreads of torpedoes into the convoy's heart. The tanker, Harry Luckenbach, was hit first. Seconds later, the Granville exploded, its cargo of munitions detonating in a fireball that lit the sea for miles. Survivors described the ocean glowing as if the sun had risen beneath us. The convoy escorts fought desperately. Commander Peter Gretton aboard HMS Dianthus recalled later, "It was chaos. Radar cluttered, radio jammed, and torpedoes everywhere. We were fighting shadows." The Germans had perfected their night surface attacks, running their submarines on the surface at high speed between the merchant ships, invisible to sonar. By dawn on March 17th, 21, merchant ships had been sunk. Over 300 men were dead. And yet, as the sun rose, something strange happened. The U-boats suddenly withdrew. British radio operators intercepted fragments of Enigma transmissions, suggesting confusion among German command. Orders to reposition, followed by abrupt silence. It was as if half the Wolfpack had simply vanished. Post-war German naval records revealed an odd gap in communication. U-384 and U-523, both confirmed to have participated, were never heard from again. Their last coordinates placed them in the middle of the convoy route, yet no Allied ship reported their destruction. When the war ended, their loss was quietly listed as cause unknown. Some naval historians suggest that one of the boats may have been struck by a malfunctioning torpedo or even rammed by a merchantman in the chaos. Others point to a darker mystery. Intercepted Enigma logs indicate that a U-boat reported strange underwater contacts, not British, not ours. For the survivors of HX-229 and SC-122, the horror left scars that would never fade. Merchant sailor James Mackenzie later wrote in his diary, "We did not fight an enemy we could see. We fought the sound, the pings, the whispers, the propellers in the dark." The strain of constant vigilance pushed men to the edge. Sleep was rare, fear was constant. By March 20th, the convoys finally reached British waters, escorted by reinforcement groups from Londonderry. Out of 90 ships combined, 22 had been sunk. But the loss came with an unintended consequence. The battle had stretched the U-boats to their limit. Fuel shortages, mechanical failures, and increasing Allied air patrols meant the tide of war was about to shift. In Bletchley Park, British cryptanalysts were already cracking the latest Enigma ciphers. Within weeks, new intelligence would give the Allies the upper hand. Still, questions lingered. What caused the sudden radio silence among the Wolfpack that March? Were the missing submarines victims of their own technology? Or of something deeper, something that the sea swallowed whole? As spring gave way to May 1943, the Atlantic would see one more decisive showdown. Convoy ONS-5 would mark the turning of the tide, and the mysterious disappearance of several submarines whose fates remain uncertain to this day. May 1943, the tide of the Atlantic War was about to turn. For nearly 4 years, German U-boats had prowled the seas with ruthless efficiency, sending thousands of Allied sailors and merchantmen to watery graves. But now, for the first time, the hunters were becoming the hunted. The story of Convoy ONS-5, a westbound formation of slow-moving merchant ships, would become a symbol of that shift and of the mysterious shadows that accompanied it. Convoy ONS-5 departed Liverpool on April 21st, 1943, bound for Halifax, Nova Scotia. It consisted of 42 merchant vessels escorted by 16 warships, including the destroyer HMS Duncan and several newly equipped corvettes like HMS Snowflake and HMS Pink. The convoy was under the command of Captain Robert Sherwood, an experienced officer who had seen the worst of the Atlantic War. The men aboard the convoy were weary but hopeful. British technology had improved. Radar, HF, DF, high-frequency direction finding, and the Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar had given the escorts new teeth. Still, the Germans were far from beaten. Admiral Karl Dönitz, determined to regain control, ordered 43 U-boats from multiple Wolfpacks, groups such as Star, Specht, and Fink, to intercept ONS-5 mid-Atlantic. The two forces would meet in what would become the most decisive convoy battle of the war. The first contact came on April 29, U-650, and U-258 spotted the convoy's smoke trails through the fog. Using encrypted Enigma messages, they summoned reinforcements. For 4 nights, the Germans harassed the convoy, sinking 3 merchant ships. But Sherwood's escort group responded with remarkable precision. Using radar-guided attacks, they struck back. HMS Pink scored a direct hit with depth charges, destroying U-192, one of the first confirmed kills using the new Type 144 sonar set. As May began, the weather worsened. Gale-force winds tore through the sea, scattering ships and submerging decks under walls of water. It was chaos, but also opportunity. The storm broke apart the Wolfpack's coordination. Many U-boats lost radio contact, their antennas frozen or damaged by the relentless waves. One U-boat commander later wrote, "The Atlantic itself became our enemy that week. We could not see, could not dive, could not fight." On the night of May 5 to 6, the main attack began. In a running battle that lasted over 12 hours, ONS-5 fought for its life. Torpedoes streaked through the black water as depth charges thundered in reply. HMS Lochmorlish and HMS Duncan launched coordinated counterstrikes, while merchant crews fired everything from Lewis guns to signal flares in desperation. Amid the chaos, U-boat losses mounted. U-125, crippled by gunfire, attempted to surrender, but with no capacity to take prisoners, the corvette HMS Snowflake rammed and sank her. U-531, U-638, and U-630 were all destroyed in quick succession. By dawn, the battle was over. 7 Allied ships had been lost, but 6 U-boats were confirmed sunk and several others heavily damaged. It was a turning point. For the first time, the hunters had suffered more than their prey, and yet amid the triumph, there were odd reports, details that even official records struggle to explain. Multiple ships reported sonar contacts that didn't match known U-boat patterns. Sub-Lieutenant Michael Wainwright of HMS Lochmorlish noted in his log, "Echo returns not consistent with submarine, stationary, metallic, but vanishing instantly." Some escort commanders dismissed these as false readings caused by temperature layers or wreck debris, but others weren't so sure. 2 days later, Allied intelligence intercepted fragmentary transmissions from U-223 and U-258 before both boats disappeared without trace. Post-war German records confirmed neither was sunk by enemy action. They were simply gone. No wrecks, no debris, no survivors. One Enigma decrypt referenced unexplained loss of contact near position 57°, 39°. For decades, those coordinates would remain a mystery, though in 1999, sonar scans discovered 2 wrecks in that area, crushed beyond recognition, their hulls twisted in ways inconsistent with depth charge explosions. For Captain Sherwood and his exhausted men, ONS-5 was a hard-won victory, but even in triumph the sea gave no peace. Survivors spoke of eerie moments in the fog after the battle. Long, metallic creaks echoing from below, as if the ocean itself were groaning. Whether it was wreckage settling, collapsing pressure hulls, or something else, no one could say. The aftermath of ONS-5 marked the turning of the Atlantic War. Donitz, facing unsustainable losses, withdrew his wolf packs from the North Atlantic by late May 1943. The Allies had finally gained the upper hand through technology, coordination, and intelligence. But for many sailors, victory came at a strange emotional cost. They had seen too much, heard too much, and the ocean still held too many secrets. As the war dragged toward its end, Germany's desperation grew. Rumors began to spread through Allied intelligence circles of new U-boats, faster and deadlier than ever, built to carry not cargo, but something far more mysterious. And in 1945, during the dying days of the Reich, one such mission, known only as Operation Teardrop, would bring the U-boat war to its shadowy conclusion. April 1945. The war in Europe was nearing its end. Berlin was under siege, Hitler's Reich crumbling, and yet across the Atlantic the US Navy was on high alert. Reports from intercepted German communications suggested that several U-boats had left occupied Norway on what Admiral Karl Donitz described as missions of decisive importance. No one knew their target. Some feared they carried V weapons, chemical warheads, or even Nazi officials fleeing to South America. The Allies called their response Operation Teardrop. The mission began in the first week of April. The US Navy's Eastern Sea frontier. Command organized a massive anti-submarine screen stretching from Newfoundland to the Azores. 6 escort carrier groups, dozens of destroyer escorts, and hundreds of aircraft fanned out across the North Atlantic. The orders were explicit: locate and destroy all incoming German submarines at any cost. The war might have been won in Europe, but in the Atlantic, it wasn't over. The German force consisted of 7 Type 1C and IXD U-boats, long-range submarines capable of crossing the ocean without refueling. They had departed Kristiansand and Bergen in late March under sealed orders. Among them was U-546, commanded by Kapitän-Leutnant Paul Just, an experienced officer who had already survived 2 years in the U-boat arm. His orders, discovered after the war, read simply: proceed west, maintain radio silence, deliver special cargo to destination Newland. Historians still debate what Newland referred to. Some believed it meant Newfoundland. Others suspected a code name for secret rendezvous coordinates off the US coast. For the men of the US Navy's Escort Carrier Task Group 2213, led by USS Bogue, the hunt began in earnest. On April 16th, radar aircraft from Bogue detected a periscope wake 600 miles west of the Azores. Depth charges followed. Within minutes, oil slicks rose to the surface. 1 U-boat destroyed, but more were out there, closing in. On April 23rd, sonar operators aboard USS Frederick C. Davis picked up contact, a faint, rhythmic echo beneath the waves. As the destroyer altered course to investigate, a torpedo struck her midship. The explosion tore the vessel apart. 115 men were lost. The attacker was U-546. It had struck from near point-blank range, then dived deep, pursued by 6 US destroyers. What followed was a relentless hunt lasting over 10 hours. Destroyer escorts USS Flaherty and Nyanza took turns dropping depth charges in coordinated patterns. The sea churned, explosions echoing through the night. Finally, a massive blast was heard, a secondary detonation from deep below. At 2200 hours, debris and bodies surfaced. U-546 had been destroyed. Only 33 of its crew were rescued, including its captain. When interrogated aboard USS Bogue, Kapitän-Leutnant Just revealed little. He denied carrying V-weapons or any special cargo. "We were told to reach America," he said, and to await further orders. Yet when divers later examined the wreck off the Azores, they reported something curious. The torpedo tubes were empty, but the aft compartments appeared stripped of standard munitions racks. Some compartments, they noted, looked modified, as if for the transport of large cylindrical containers. The Navy's official report, declassified decades later, made no mention of this. The cargo, whatever it was, had vanished with the ship. Over the next 2 weeks, 4 more U-boats were destroyed: U-880, U-881, U-35, and U-853. Each was heading west. Each refused to surrender. U-853 managed to sink the steamer Black Point off Rhode Island on May 5th, the last US merchant vessel lost to enemy action in the Atlantic. Hours later, the German submarine was hunted down and destroyed by depth charges. The war ended 3 days later, and yet 2 boats, U-530 and U-977, were unaccounted for. They would not surface until months later, appearing mysteriously off the coast of Argentina in July and August 1945, their crews claiming to have fled after Germany's surrender. But even these accounts raised suspicion. Both submarines had discarded documents and logs before capture. U-530's officers claimed they had been on a training mission. U-977's commander said they wished to avoid Soviet capture. US and British investigators doubted both stories. A report from the Office of Naval Intelligence dated September 1945 concluded, evidence suggests U-boats departing in late March were carrying classified material or personnel, nature unknown. Theories abounded: secret weapon components, financial reserves, or even diplomatic archives meant for sympathetic regimes abroad. None were proven. Operation Teardrop ended officially on May 10, 1945. The US Navy lost 1 destroyer and over 100 men. The Germans lost nearly 300 submariners. But beneath the statistics lay a lingering mystery. What was the true purpose of those final U-boat missions? Why did Dönitz risk precious resources when Germany was already defeated? Some historians suggest that the admiral, ever the tactician, hoped to negotiate by showcasing Germany's reach, proof that the Kriegsmarine could still threaten American shores. Others believe those submarines carried materials meant for a post-war future, somewhere beyond Europe's ruins. The Atlantic gave up no answers. Even now, the wrecks of U-546 and her sisters rest deep below the ocean, their secrets sealed in steel and salt. But their story marks the end of an era, the last convoys, the last wolf packs, and the last breath of a dying regime's desperate ambition. As the guns fell silent across Europe, the Atlantic War faded into memory. Yet in its depths, thousands of ships still slept, and among them, some that vanished without a trace. The final chapter of the Battle of the Atlantic was not about victory or defeat, but disappearance. Convoy HX-231 would be one of them, a fleet swallowed by the sea, its fate unknown even today. May 1945, the guns had fallen silent in Europe. But in the vast grey wilderness of the Atlantic, echoes of war still lingered. The Battle of the Atlantic had lasted nearly 6 years, claiming more than 3,500 Allied merchant ships and over 700 U-boats. It was a conflict waged in the deep, unseen, relentless, and merciless. Yet even as peace returned, mysteries remained. Among them was the fate of Convoy HX-231, a flotilla that vanished almost entirely, leaving behind little more than fragments and unanswered questions. Convoy HX-231 departed Halifax, Nova Scotia, on April 3, 1943. Bound for Liverpool. 50 merchant ships carried food, oil, and ammunition to support Britain's war effort. They were escorted by the 2nd Escort Group under Commander Donald McIntyre, one of the Royal Navy's most respected anti-submarine tacticians. The convoy's route was well established, its defences strong. But unknown to McIntyre, German radio intercepts had pinpointed their position within hours of departure. Donitz's wolf packs were already moving to intercept. The U-boats came from the north, the notorious group known as Löwenherz, Lionheart, including U-404 under Otto von Bülow and U-632 under Hans-Dieter Heinecke. They converged in the mid-Atlantic gap, the Black Pit, where Allied aircraft could not reach. For 3 days, radio silence prevailed. Then, on April 6th, the attack began. The night was clear, the sea eerily calm. At 0200 hours, lookouts aboard HMS Offa sighted torpedo wakes slicing through the moonlit water. Within seconds, the tanker Gulf State exploded, a fireball lighting the horizon. Chaos followed. U-404 struck again, sinking the Harperless and North Britain. The escorts counterattacked furiously, their depth charges shaking the sea. The battle raged through the night. Sonar pings, explosions, cries in the dark. By dawn, 9 merchant ships were gone. Commander McIntyre radioed for reinforcements, but weather conditions worsened. A dense fog descended over the convoy, severing visual contact between ships. Then, something inexplicable happened. Communications with 7 vessels ceased simultaneously. No distress signals, no sightings, no wreckage. When the fog lifted 36 hours later, they were simply gone. Post-war analysis of Enigma intercepts suggested that U-boat activity in the area had ceased by that time. None of Donitz's commanders reported further attacks, and no submarines claimed the missing ships. Allied intelligence was baffled. Search aircraft dispatched from Iceland found only empty lifeboats and floating cargo. One report from a Liberator patrol described an oil slick stretching for miles, but no debris large enough to identify. The disappearance of those ships became one of the Atlantic War's enduring enigmas. Some speculated they had struck mines, others thought they had collided and sunk in the fog. But survivors from nearby vessels told of hearing unearthly metallic groans beneath the water, followed by a sudden stillness. Sonar operators aboard HMS Offa recorded unusual readings. Slow, rhythmic pulses, unlike any submarine engine known at the time. The logs were classified and later lost in Admiralty archives. What is certain is that the battle for HX-231 marked a turning point. Allied air cover finally extended into the mid-Atlantic, closing the so-called Black Pit. Long-range B-24 Liberators began hunting U-boats day and night. By summer's end, German losses were catastrophic. Dönitz would later call May 1943 the month of fate, the moment the Atlantic War was lost. But the human cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of sailors, British, Canadian, American, Norwegian, and German, had perished in the struggle. The ocean floor became their tomb. Even decades later, their wrecks lie scattered from Greenland to Gibraltar, silent testimonies to courage and despair. In 2013, deep-sea explorers found the remains of what they believed to be one of HX-231's missing freighters, the Fort Concord, resting upright at a depth of 4,600 meters. Her hull was intact, but her holds were empty. No sign of the crew, no clues to her final hours. Historians still debate the details of the convoy's fate. Some believe the missing ships were torpedoed in rapid succession and sank before they could signal. Others suspect navigational errors drove them far off course, where storms claimed them. Yet for those who study the Battle of the Atlantic, the truth may be less important than the legacy. The convoy system, flawed, courageous, and human, embodied the Allied struggle itself. Persistence in the face of an unseen enemy. As the war closed, the Atlantic returned to silence. The waves rolled over graves both known and unknown. The U-boats that once terrorized the seas now lay scattered and broken, their rusting hulls home to fish and coral. But even in peace, the ocean kept its secrets. Each year, new wrecks are found, sometimes intact, sometimes shattered, and each one tells a story of men who vanished without a trace. The Battle of the Atlantic was more than a contest of machines or strategies. It was a war of endurance, waged in darkness, where courage was measured not in victories, but in survival. The convoys that braved those waters, HX-79, PQ-17, HX-229, ONS-5, HX-231, carried not just cargo, but the hope of freedom itself. And though the war ended long ago, the sea still remembers. Somewhere in the deep, the faint echo of sonar, the hum of engines, and the ghostly whisper of Morse code remind us that history's greatest mysteries are not found on land, but beneath the waves.